The next issue, I believe, goes to a phrase which Rabbi Hart Stark used in his letter, and I think perhaps this is a crucial area where friends could differ, where he speaks of viewing the acceptance of the mitzvah of tefillin by women as a legitimate practice, albeit different from our communal practice, but one that has halakhic justification. So a lot in this discussion is going to hang on the question of what would constitute halakhic justification. And Rabbi Hart Stark, who has always been, and I only know him, I think, somewhere around 35 years. Even as a junior in high school, he was known as like really one of the most accomplished young men in the yeshiva, and nothing has changed. He's only gotten smarter with age. He cites here, obviously he wasn't writing this as a tshuva. He cites here, it has basis in the Rishonim. He mentions the Rambam, the Rashba, and the Sefer HaChinuch, and perhaps the Mechaber of Yosef Karo, that he found basis for the notion of women accepting the mitzvah of tefillin on themselves. Now here, I think that to say that there are opinions in the Rishonim and to equate that with halakhic justification is a methodological jump that I would take issue with. Particularly today in the great culture of the Bar Ilan Shilas and Shuvas project, we have access to a couple of thousands of years of various opinions. These opinions will be winnowed in one of two ways. The first question to ask is, were these academic opinions or were they put into practice? Right? There are many discussions in halacha which never got beyond the academic phase. In other words, in concept, one could understand the possibility of X. Would that rabbi who entertained that possibility, would he, if someone came to him and said, okay, then can my daughter put on tefillin? We have no such record. And discussions which were held for only in a purely academic context and never were actualized in practice, never moved from the Beis Medrash to application, those are much more dubious. Second, one way to test a given practice, which may, by reaching back, have a basis in rabbinic literature, is to ask, has this ever actually, certainly in the last 500-600 years, has it been expressed as halacha l'maisa in any particular community? Did it hold on? So that if you were to suggest, for example, that among the Jews of Yemen, an ancient and very authentic but somewhat isolated community, if you were to say that among the Jews of Yemen, tefillin have been worn by women for 1,000 years, that would be a compelling argument, because it would say that this has been in practice. It made the leap from concept to practicality. That would be a telling process. However, what we find in the case of tefillin in particular There are traditions of why it is that women were discouraged from putting on tefillin, even in places where they were encouraged to do other positive commandments. There, from the Rama, who is the authority for Ashkenaz, under most circumstances. Now people will say to you, there are occasions where we dispute the Rama. And that is true. There are actually traditions of areas of halacha where in certain areas of halacha the Rama is treated like, an equal with other early Achronim. However, in many areas of halacha, the Rama has a towering presence in Ashkenaz, and particularly, and this is something which was pointed out to me clearly by Rabbi Genak, in cases where none of the people who have the right to argue with the Rama, in other words, the people who weren't nervous about the Rama, like Rosenblatt is. I mean, if the Rama walked into that door, aside from the fact that I would be quite surprised to see a person who'd been dead for a few hundred years, I could get over that. The Rama walked into that door. I would be so struck with awe and trembling that I would probably need somebody to hold me up. But there were people who didn't feel that way about the Rama. The Shach and the Taz, the Magen Avraham, these were people who were not afraid on a good day to take the Rama on and to suggest that the halacha should take a different direction. In this particular case, there is no one of real stature since the Rama's time. And remember, he also knew the Rambam and the Rashba, etc. There is no one in the classic Halakhic literature, none of those who could take him on this point ever did. And that means that whereas we may have something, we may have an act, a behavior which has a mention in Halakhic literature, I would argue that we do not have what, as I understand it, meets the criteria of Halakhic justification for a new practice. I believe we have textual echoes, but not to the point which would create Halakhic with Halakhic justification. Now, what are factors that can move a text into the area of Halakhic justification? So I'll talk about one which I believe is one which is possible, and two which are spurious. Let us understand what moves the Halakhic process. Much has been made of the phrase where there's a Halakhic will, there's a Halakhic way. So let's ask ourselves, what is it that creates a Halakhic will? And let's ask this respectfully, looking at the system as one which is both sacred in its origins and sacred in its mobilization throughout Jewish history. The first thing that creates Halakhic will, frankly, is suffering. When a Jew or Jews is suffering and needs relief, Halakhic authorities throughout the ages have displayed extraordinary creativity and zeal. You have only to read the traditional literature about agunot, particularly after great conflicts like the world wars, where people saw that people's lives, aside from loss, were further being compromised by their inability to get a halakhic status which allowed them to continue. And that goes right down to 9/11. You can read the book that Rabbi Rees, our own Rabbi Rees, is a hero in this area. He and Rav Gedalia Dov Schwartz, they both live and be well, were heroes in helping families after 9/11 to move forward. So the first thing is need, is suffering. If a Jew is suffering, if there's real need, if there's economic duress. I mean, we had a case in Riverdale recently, I can't reveal the details, where a given business, which was really tottering, needed a significant halachic allowance. Rabbi Willig worked, I don't even want to think about how many hours he researched until he found a reasonable halachic argument. And after he found that halachic argument, in addition to consulting with colleagues, he even called me to see that I was comfortable. And with all that, he told me that he had been up all night weighing and looking into his conscience before he gave this heter, which he did. In this one case, this particular case, believe me, I don't believe that the worry about this particular person's financial future, the worry that this person experienced in their sleepless nights, was in any way greater than the worry that Rabbi Willig experienced on their behalf. Not his worry about would he give a heter, but first he began from the sense of what this meant to those people. The second thing which moves the halachic process, perhaps a little one notch down, is opportunity. In other words, when we can innovate within halacha and thereby achieve some great goal. I think that the development, for example, of the Beis Yaakov movement could be perhaps classified under this. An opportunity, also a need, but a place where the halachic system saw motivation. The least, frankly, the least effective way to move the halachic system is to demand of it. To say, get us permission to do X. That tends, frankly, and this is descriptive, not necessarily, I'm just telling you how the machinery works. The machinery tends to go into lockdown in the face of someone coming with demand. You must give us a way to do this because we want to do it. Poskim it's just not a big motivator. It's not the way they tend to work. So when we talk about what can move halachic process, in some cases even to the point with collaboration, with due diligence, sometimes to even reach back for precedents, real suffering has the best shot, opportunity has a decent shot, demand has a very small shot. So how is it that others suggest we move forward? Well, one is to, frankly, ignore the organic side of halacha and simply to say, we can find a text from way back when, and we will take it, and it allows us, we find precedent, and that's sufficient. That is, frankly, the way the conservative movement reached some of its conclusions in areas where their halakhic system deviated in theory from traditional psak. Another way is, I think, more subtle and more dangerous. Understand that all of halacha is not black and white. It's not, you can do this, you can't do this. Here's how much matzah you have to eat in order to be... It's not all that simple, because within halacha, and this frankly is what characterizes what I would call the more universal halakhic insiders, people like Rav Kook, Rav Herzog, etc. There is something which we could call meta-halacha. Meta-halacha is norms distilled from the halacha, but which are not particular to one area or another. So, for example, kavod habrios, the respect for human dignity, which is applied in many areas of halacha, for example in Hilchos Shabbos, where certain things are permitted because they will prevent a human being from being humiliated. Right? And there are sugyas all over Shas about kavod habrios. Darkei shalom, things which bring peace with non-Jewish neighbors. So, for example, the extension of philanthropic activity beyond the Jewish community, to help the non-Jewish poor, to heal the non-Jewish sick, right? These are what I would call meta-halakic principles. Imitating these are principles which are, I would say, injected into the halacha, new principles which are finessed with a kind of an inductive process. What do I mean? A concept, let me give an outlandish example so that before everyone picks up their swords, we can at least have an idea what I'm trying to get across. The Reform movement has been known to say that a woman's right to choose an abortion is a Jewish concept. It doesn't mean that's not true. It doesn't mean it's a Jewish concept. It means that it is part of the Weltanschauung of Reform Judaism, and in one way or another they will try to find precedent in the tradition, but it's not coming from the tradition. It's in a sense being imposed, or on a good day with a strong tailwind, discovered in the tradition. Concepts like egalitarianism, or more slippery inclusiveness, which are discovered by inductive reasoning. In other words, if you find a given rabbi who rules on a given case where someone who thought he or she was not included in a given practice, and they find justification to include them, to allow them to do a certain thing, and therefore to say, what was motivating this rabbi? He believed in inclusiveness. So if you went to that rabbi and you said to him, do you believe in inclusiveness? He would say, what are you talking about? I don't know how, tell me where in the Gemara inclusiveness appears. I know that in this particular case, I see a way in psak. The problem with these meta concepts is they're not meta coming out of halacha, they're meta coming from other places and then being sort of dropped on halacha. When they are used as halachic guidance, in other words, we will say this because it advances the value of, for example, inclusiveness, then you stand a serious risk of introducing foreign matter into the body of halacha. Something which stems from a completely different area. And indeed, whereas inclusiveness values the dropping of all distinctions and barriers in the general culture, I would say that you can make a much stronger case in halacha for the concept of havdalah, which is to make distinctions. We do make distinctions. Hamavdil ben kodesh lechol, ben or lechoshech, ben Yisrael lo amim, ben yom hashavi l'sheshes yemei hamaseh, all the things where we make a fine line, and we do make a fine line. We make a fine line. It's called 1 minute it's Shabbos, and the next minute it isn't Shabbos. Someone has to tell you, when is Shabbos over? Yesterday, Shim was talking to his children, he said, and he had to make a flight last night to Chicago. I hope he got out all right. And he said, Shabbos is over at 6:12. And I said, no, 6:13. Does it make a difference? Yeah. Conceptually, Hamavdil ben Kodesh L'chol means we are in the business of making distinctions. Now, distinctions are not intended to be pejorative. The decision whether I am or am not a Kohen, whether I can or can't go to a cemetery, whether I can or cannot duchen, doesn't mean that if I'm not a Kohen, my value has been diminished. It means that a distinction has been made, and I have to find God on my side of a given line. And so, as we look for correct halakhic process, we have to know that it follows certain steps. And that it is, first, the mere appearance of a text somewhere in Jewish history is not the automatic basis for halakhic action. Two, that the absence of any example in a living Jewish community, now or along the way, is a very serious question mark, a marker, a red flag. And that the desire to bring halakhic practice into congruence with values only really works when those values are from the halacha, because that means they're as much a halachic source as the specific ones, and not when they are values which have been imposed from on top. And so the question of what is halachic justification is very much the point at which I think good people might differ.